Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 68. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
My name is Chris Pounds. I've lived in Northampton since 1983. From the sort of late 80s to about 2000, I ran a sort of radical bookshop called Blackcurrant Books in Northampton. And I'm very enthusiastic about local history.
Chris, tell me about the object which is in the exhibition and which we're interested in this particular episode of the podcast series.
The object is a cobblestone with an inscription on it that says that it was thrown in a riot in 1874. And this election riot was the low point in an election campaign, a series of 3 elections at which the controversial sort of radical Charles Bradlaugh stood as a candidate for one of the town's seats.
Charles Bradlaugh is very well known in this town. Elsewhere, he is commemorated not only by a statue, but also a pub which bears his name. But who was Charles Bradlaugh?
He was a leading sort of radical of the 19th century, campaigning for votes for all, most controversially votes for women, and he was best known as a free thinker and an atheist, and his sort of theological views provoked a lot of hostility. He was a person whose views were a century ahead of his time. Probably his greatest impact was his publishing of a manual of birth control, and he was put on trial for that, and that sort of really had a massive influence on Victorian society, this sort of taking an interest in family planning and the size of Victorian families. He was also an anti-colonialist. He's probably better known in India, where he was asked to represent India as well as Northampton, because India had no representation in Parliament in the 1880s.
Without wanting to put modern-day political names into his place, was he what you would call a radical? You talked about him being a free thinker. Did he ascribe to any of the traditional, standard political parties, or was he literally one of a kind?
So he was a journalist and an activist and a campaigner, but he had aspirations to enter Parliament and help change society for the better as a politician. And he'd visited Northampton as a young man, as a speaker, and sort of been a popular and welcome frequent visitor. And when there was electoral reform in 1866, the prospect of the votes for adult males being introduced, many of his local supporters, admirers, asked him to consider standing for Northampton at the election of 1868 to challenge one of the Liberal candidates, Lord Henley, who was seen by many as being not an appropriate candidate for Northampton.
So in inviting him to represent Northampton, Northampton embraced him rather more than he'd embraced Northampton.
He liked coming to Northampton. He was loyal to Northampton, and he could have been a candidate in other constituencies where he might have not had so many problems to be considered as a Liberal Party candidate. But the local Liberal Party executive were not prepared to have him at any cost, and this resulted in a serious split within the Liberal Party, and Bradlaugh standing independently as a radical candidate against Lord Henley, the official Liberal candidate.
So to use another oft-used phrase, he was a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons in that case. Why did we end up with riots on the market square of Northampton being one of the oldest markets in the country, and a place that has seen all kinds of events in its own history?
Right from the very start of his sort of campaign in 1868, where there was sort of massive enthusiasm for him, songs composed, Bradlaugh for Northampton, great enthusiasm and passion that this was the man, perfect candidate for radical Northampton. Right from the start, his sort of theological views were used as a means of attacking him and trying to divide support. So a large number of supporters were sort of the nonconformists, Congregationalists, Methodists, very devout Christians. who had no problems with Bradlaugh, but his opponents argued, how can you consider yourself a Christian if you support such a person who has said so many offensive things against their faith? So the various election campaigns, 1868, a general election campaign in 1874, February 74, and then a by-election in October 1874 when the riots took place. All these campaigns were sort of poisoned by this toxic hostility to Bradlaugh and this use of bigotry as a weapon to sort of divide support for Bradlaugh.
So the establishment didn't like him, but the people did. There was an election. He was duly elected, but because of his religious beliefs, he got into trouble with Parliament.
Well, he was elected in the end. He came bottom of the poll in 1868, bottom of the poll in February of 1874, but Lord Henley lost his seat to Pickering Phipps, Conservative candidate. In 1874, the campaign was even more toxic than the previous campaigns. The official Liberal candidate, William Fowler, made awful allegations against Bradlaugh. He wrote a note to Bradlaugh asking Bradlaugh to confirm whether he was married to his wife and whether his recently deceased mother was still in receipt of parish relief. This kind of infuriated the normally cool-headed Bradlaugh, and this source of anger and frustration was reflected by his supporters. And when Bradlaugh came bottom of the poll yet again, and two Conservatives were representing Northampton, I think there must have been a feeling of sort of great shame that radical Northampton was represented by sort of Tories, and this sort of anger from his supporters just got out of control on the market square, and people attacked the Palmerston pub, which had been the Liberal HQ, and the Mercury newspaper, which had supported the Liberal campaign.
Which is why we have a cobblestone in the exhibition marked up saying that it was used during these riots. I believe as the riot was taking place, to use another well-known phrase, the Riot Act was read. I mean, literally, the Riot Act was read out to those doing the rioting.
Yes, the Riot Act was read, I think, at first on Wood Hill by the Lord Mayor in the early evening, and then several times on the market square to no avail. Bradlaugh was due to travel to America on that very evening. He was travelling on a lecture tour to America. He had to leave, but he was in amongst the rioters, begging them to go home. And eventually the Riot Act was read again on the fountain of the statue, and there's a really great illustration of that, a graphic engraving of that moment. The troops were called out, and about 10 o'clock in the evening there was a lot of trouble getting permission for them to come, but they came to the market square and the rioting wound down. But it was a kind of a low point in the election campaigns between 1868 and 1880. Even in 1880, there was a general election. The local Liberals would not have Bradlaugh, but their official candidate, the Right Honourable Ayrton Smee, fell off his horse a couple of weeks before the election and had to withdraw, and a deal was quickly done whereby Bradlaugh shared a joint platform with the other candidate, James Labouchere, and he was successfully elected to Parliament, but then not allowed to take his seat. The dispute was over the oath of allegiance that all MPs have to take before they take their seat, where you swear allegiance on the Bible to the monarch. Bradlaugh, as a outspoken Republican and atheist, was unhappy to take this oath, and he said he would prefer to take a solemn affirmation, which was available to religious minorities. Bradlaugh hoped that he would be allowed to take this solemn oath, but this was refused. Bradlaugh then said he would take the original oath, but that was refused too. He had nowhere to go. He actually begged to take the oath. He ran in on one occasion and kissed the Bible and took the oath informally, but over a period of up until 1866, the next general election of 1868, Bradlaugh was kicked out of Parliament, returned in by-elections, and Northampton was without one of its representatives.
He's quite a turbulent character, or at least he's turbulent through society's view of Charles Bradlaugh, if only for his stand, for his views. In a sentence, Chris, what happened to Charles Bradlaugh? What is his legacy for Northamptonshire?
I think his legacy is that Northamptonians, they knew they had great pride and that they'd stood up for important principles, and the whole world had looked to this sort of battle in Northampton, and eventually they won.
Are you surprised that that was the case, given Northampton's association with Charles I, the Civil War, and Naseby?
There's something about sort of Northampton people, Northampton and the shoemakers, the notorious infidel Crispinites. This was like a high point in sort of Northampton radicalism. And I don't understand the association between shoemaking and atheism. That is something that is one of the reasons why it suggested Bradlaugh was so popular in Northampton. But there's certainly a long, long tradition of republicanism, and I can understand that because the aristocracy had a grip on the politics of Northamptonshire up until 1868. That was the big issue in that first campaign. And the aristocracy, still big landowners in Northamptonshire. So that's historically a lot of Republican sentiment.
Chris, just before we come to a close on this particular podcast, the Cobblestone is the Cobblestone, but it has been marked up. It does have its own story as a piece of the market square.
Yes, there's a transcript of the court sessions after the riot where the sort of alleged rioters were put on trial or were in front of the magistrates. People were arrested on the night of the riot, and evidence was produced in court. Stones were produced that had been taken off them on the evening. This cobblestone may well have been one of those pieces of evidence, one of those stones taken off the rioters on the evening of the riot.
In our exhibition, it is number 68. As far as the courts were concerned, exhibit number 68 was actually used on the day, but was then used in a court case.
I suspect that might be the case, yes, that it might not actually have been thrown, that it might have been taken off one of these rioters, taken out of their pockets.
But what a story it can tell.
Yeah.
I don't think there are too many people who've had a riot in their name, notwithstanding the fact that on the occasion he tried to quell it and did have his political moment, which of course is why we're now marking it in this particular exhibition. Come and see the Cobblestone, come and learn more about the story. Chris, thanks for telling it today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.